Hello, everyone. I'm Denise Mausderall, a professor joint between the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs and the Center for Policy Research on Energy and the Environment and the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department. I'm really delighted today to welcome you to the CPRE Bradford seminar being given by Sunita Narain, the Director General of the Center for Science and Environment in Delhi, India. Sunita has been at CSE since 1982, where she's been internationally visible as an environmental advocate for the past nearly 40 years. Today, she manages over 100 staff at the center and has a strong media presence in India, as well as being an advocate for science-based solutions to a suite of environmental challenges in India. Her work has emphasized environmental justice with an emphasis on the importance of an improved environment for the poor. In her years at the center, she has studied the relationship between environment and development and worked to create public consciousness about the need for sustainable development. She's received a variety of prizes, of which I'll mention just a few here. In 2005, she was awarded the Padma Shri by the government of India, the fourth highest civilian award the government offers. In 2005, the Center for Science and Environment under her leadership was awarded the Stockholm Water Prize. In 2016, she was named to Time magazine's list of 100 most influential people. And in 2020, she received the Edinburgh Medal, which is awarded each year in Scotland for an individual's use of science and technology to improve the understanding and well-being of humanity. I actually first met Sunita at the 5th Conference of the Parties to the Framework Convention on Climate Change back in 1999, which was my first year at Princeton. And about 10 years ago, I saw her again at the CSE headquarters in Delhi, because I was working on the impact of black carbon emissions from India on public health and the black carbon deposits and the glaciers in the Himalaya, which we thought would contribute to glacial melting. She introduced me then to the group that was working on air pollution at CSE. And we discussed the case that she had recently won in front of the Indian Supreme Court, requiring that diesel engines, which emit black carbon, be replaced with compressed natural gas in taxis and buses in 13 major Indian cities. This was a major decision which has helped reduce air pollutant levels in Indian cities and protect public health in India, as well as reducing black carbon deposition in the Himalayas. Today, she continues her environmental work to combat air pollution, but also researches and advocates for water security and sound management, food and water safety, and working for an effective and equitable climate change regime. Please join me in welcoming her. And Sunita, we're delighted to have you back at Princeton. I think you've been here once before for another seminar, that time in person. This time you'll talk, as your title says, about COVID-19, learning from the crisis and reimagining the future for environment and climate challenges. Welcome.
Thank you, Denise. And it's so wonderful to see you again and be with you at this seminar. I think, it's virtual, it's remote, but I do hope one of these days I can be back or you can be back in Delhi and we can meet in person again. So Denise, I'm going to share my screen and then take you through some of the thoughts that we have in terms of what is happening in the world, in our world, and how do we see ourselves reimagining the future post-COVID and for a climate risk world. And I think both challenges are so crucial in the world that we live in today. I mean, firstly, let's be clear, we have never seen such times before. I mean, I cannot, for most of us, we did not live through the world wars. And so we have certainly never witnessed such disruption, never imagined the collapse of our economies, literally like a pack of cards which have been wiped out. And what we have to remember at all times is that the worst hit are the poor, the disadvantaged, the black, the brown, or just the poor. The poor are most vulnerable to the virus because of their living conditions, congested homes, dirty surroundings with no water or sewage management. But they're also most vulnerable because of the collapse of the economy. They are suffering, and this is just not right. But as we see COVID-19 and its disruption of our economies and the way it has run through the livelihoods of very poor. We also have to remember that this is the time when another catastrophe is awaiting us. And governments seem to have little ability to handle the normal. And in this situation, how the very scenario of climate change is something that we are not being able to give enough attention to. And we need to understand that this is not going to go away, and it's going to make our world more vulnerable to shock and disruption. But I hear this all the time, and I'm sure you hear this in the US, and I'm sure these conversations now seem so irritating for most of us, but we do hear them, and we need to confront them. That we hear that the bushfires have always happened, floods and droughts have always happened, cyclones have always happened. So why are we linking them to climate change? And I think this is where in our world we are learning that the science of climate change is bringing the small changes that we are seeing in our world are really big changes. And that the measurement of the intensity and frequency of these events is no longer in the normal range of variation. One of the things that happened a year ago for us is, and this is at the beginning of the COVID crisis, was, if all of you remember, you would remember that we were seeing these horrific images of the fires in Australia in January of 2020. But this was also a time when in our own backyard in India, there was massive attack by locusts, destroying the fields of our farmers. But what we were not doing was to make the connection between the attacks of locusts and climate change. And what you learned is, and I give you this example because, one, that we don't know enough about what these impacts are when it affects the poor. And so we did hear about Australia. Most of us in Delhi and in India were glued to our television, looking at the horrific scenes of the fires in Australia. The connections were being made on the impact of climate change on the fires. But in our own backyard, a similar tragedy was playing out, and we didn't know. And this really is about that, the politics of inequity, the politics of the voices of the poor, which just don't make it into our world for us to understand how badly they are impacted. In this case, the fact was that locusts are desert creatures that multiply exponentially when conditions are right. And in this case, you got unseasonal rain in the desert, in the Arabian Peninsula. You got vegetation, food, where there should have been scarcity, higher temperatures. So what you got were these unusual weather events, as I just spoke about. You got massive movement of locusts, which are gregarious creatures moving across from there to across to India, to Africa, devouring fields, destroying livelihoods of farmers. And this really is about those impacts of climate change that we just don't seem to factor in enough into our conversations. We need to put a human face on the impacts of climate change. We in India are learning very clearly that there is more than enough evidence to show extreme and variable rain events are today linked to climate change, increase of floods and then droughts. More than enough evidence to show that the intensity of tropical cyclones is increasing. But more than that, and this is really that weirdness about climate science, they're becoming more unpredictable and causing therefore much more long-term ecological and livelihood damage. But this is that double whammy, because if you get these extreme rain events, and remember in our region, and I keep repeating this, the monsoon is our true finance minister. So in our region, when you get this extreme rainfall, you get this double whammy. You get flood because you cannot hold the water, and then you get prolonged periods of drought. And this then is really that phenomena that we are seeing today, that these are not single day events. They cripple people, they destroy livelihoods, they take away the development dividend. As events become more frequent, survival becomes more difficult. No option, therefore, to move, to migrate to cities and to new countries. For most of us in this conversation, we know today that the politics of immigration are some of the hottest politics, the most divisive, polarizing politics of our ages. We need to join the dots to understand how each one of these events is making the poor in the world more and more vulnerable, so that they cannot cope, they have to move. And this is also, in my world, making our cities much more unviable, because we get massive numbers of people moving to our cities today, putting a load on the infrastructure, and our inability to be able to manage our cities, which today, in most cases, live in the illegal settlements. So if you look at this data on internal displacement, you will see now there is more and more evidence to show that actually the internal displacement by what you would call new displacement, the displacement that is happening because of floods and droughts and weather-related events, is actually more today than the displacement happening because of conflicts. And this really is that new displacement that we need to understand, both in terms of the huge problems that we have with the economic model today, and on top of it, the exacerbated impacts because of climate change. So what do we do? And this then is one of the opportunities of COVID. Because, during COVID, for us in India, and I think for most of us across the world, one of the things that it has done is to make the invisible visible. We have seen massive migrant movement in our world and in the rich world. For the first time, I have seen in India where the migrants who have left our cities because our cities have turned their backs on them, that they have become visible, that we have understood of the large numbers of people who have left their villages to come and work in the cities, who are today providing us the labor, the ability to build an economic future in our cities. I see this has happened across the world. I see the face of the migrant, which till now was only being told, do not come into our countries. I've also seen how when migrants started returning back to their homes, how the value of their work was being appreciated. So what COVID has done is that the people were desperate to leave their homes because of poverty, lack of livelihood, climate risks, because of variable weather and agrarian distress, what I just talked about. But now, because of COVID, they were also desperate to return back to their homes. So this then becomes that one opportunity that we need to keep in mind as we rebuild the future of work. Is this the opportunity to invest big time to build resilience in local rural economies? And this then becomes that one moment that we have to be able to say, yes, COVID taught us that there is a value in their work, but there is also a value in investing in the local rural economies so that they do not have to leave, so that they can cope better. And that then becomes one of the ways that we can move ahead. But the other part of what COVID taught us is that we need to think about the future of production. Till now, we have built economies by discounting labor and environment. In fact, trade has moved to countries which can compete because of low cost, and that's the Chinese model. And then, of course, the Indonesian model, the Bangladeshi model, the Indian model. And all these models are about not paying for the cost of labor and not paying for the cost of cleaning up. So one of the other things that COVID has taught us is to rethink, can this be reversed? Can we pay higher cost of goods? Will our economies become less dependent on consumption-led growth, more on well-being-led growth? And this conversation, at least, needs to happen in today's world because it is linked very much to the devastation that we know that is climate change, to the catastrophe that we know of climate change. Because no country as yet has learned to get rich without emissions. In your own country, the US, there has been a massive shift, incredible shift from coal to gas, a 50% energy transition from coal to gas. Gas is still fossil, but still cleaner. EU coal use in electricity is still as high as its RE-based electricity. So in the US, you have moved from coal to gas, which is still a fossil. And in the EU, in spite of all the effort invested in renewable energy, the coal use in electricity is equivalent to its RE-based electricity. And don't get me wrong. I mean, for most of us in the world, we have exhaled after the US elections. There is no doubt that the Biden-Harris team are very welcome because they are not denying the problem of climate change. But we need action. And with the cost of shale gas so low in the US, controlling emissions will be tough. As of today, the US will not meet its Paris Agreement commitments. And we have to remember that these are not proportional to the contribution of the country to the stock of emissions in the atmosphere. Also, your transport-related emissions are increasing and the efficiency gains are being negated. And all this, I say all this not to say that the US is not doing enough, but to say that climate change is really the most inconvenient of inconvenient truths. Because it is not about emissions alone. It is about sharing emissions between nations. Because it is fundamentally about sharing growth between nations, between people. Because we know that emissions are equal to concentration, are equal to temperature rise. And this then tells us what is the carbon budget we have that we have to live within. And we know that for the world to live, to stay below 1.5 degrees centigrade, the guardrail for as much as possible to avoid the catastrophe, we can emit a certain amount. And at current rates, the world will exhaust the budget for the century in this decade itself. This is critical for us to understand the sheer inequity in the climate, in the carbon budget. And that then needs us to ask, what is the option for the world, for the poor in the world? Just look at the carbon budget and how it has got divided. This is the question of between 1850 to 2011, and you will see that the big countries of the world, the US, it's not surprising, had the bulk of the budget of the past. If you look at China, very important, a smaller player till 2011. But if you look at how this now changes, this is also very worrying Because if you look at the percentage of the global CO2 emissions from 1850 to 2030, and this tells you that the US will be 17% and China will be 16.7%, and the rest of the world will actually have nothing left to survive. So the new world has been created, new occupiers, there are new winners and losers. The US and China will get equal share of the global CO2 budget by 2030. But what happens to the rest of the world? And this then is on a per capita basis, the same chart, which will tell you. But the point is that this is not just acceptable, it is not acceptable, but the fact is it's also not workable. Because if the budget is over and we are on course on to increasing temperature, what does it mean for the poor? For the large numbers of people in India, Africa, and South America? Will they stop development? Will they stop breathing, eating, cooking, studying, and working? So how will they grow? And if they grow and the price of mitigation is too expensive for the rich, how will the poor afford it? And as they get richer, like all of us, they will emit, temperatures will increase, and we will all be at further risk. So this really is we cannot, I know it's depressing when I say this. Every time I think about this, I think, well, what then? We finish the world's budget. What happens to the world's poor? But we need to confront this reality as we go forward. We can't bury our head in the sand and think this will somehow solve itself. Because words are cheap, transformation is not. The fact is, it will cost money to be able to make that transition. And which is why what I'm deeply worried about today is this new buzzword called net zero. I know your president will do this dramatic meeting, very important meeting, to bring together climate leaders in 2 weeks' time. I know that the US will declare a net zero budget. China has said 2060, and there's pressure on India now to agree to do a net zero budget. And I keep asking myself, and I've asked this publicly, so IPCC said that the world has to turn net zero by 2050, which means that the poorer countries should have the rich countries should have turned net zero by 2030, 2020, for the poor countries to actually have a target. Today, in today's world, all India can do is to say that it will put a net zero target of 2070, 10 years after China. What does it mean? And what does net zero mean other than saying that we will continue to emit, but somehow we'll be able to soak it up in the forest, pump it back into the ground, or buy it from the developing world? But we have to remember that our forests are not wilderness. They're habitats and livelihoods of the very poor. So if we want net zero to work, we need to reduce emissions drastically and pay the price for emission reduction in foreign lands. Put the money in the hands of poor communities. Rebuild the rural economies that I spoke about earlier. But net zero works only if we have real plans to reduce emissions. Currently, all countries have an aspirational target for net zero 2050, but they're not on track even till 2030. So I think it's very important for us to discuss these openly and loudly. Otherwise, we will lose another decade fighting about the date for net zero. And I say this because the one thing that we must learn post-COVID is that we are interconnected. We are an interdependent world. Coronavirus moved with speed across nations, cities, villages, because we are interconnected. The movement of people, goods between nations, within nations is massive. And what we have also learned is that we are as strong as our strongest link, weak as our weakest link. If the virus remains in any region, any country, the contagion will spread. Today, We are learning that if the vaccine access is not available to everyone in the world, the mutations will grow. And if the mutations keep growing, we will all remain unsafe. We will all remain vulnerable. So we need to provide for all for us to survive this. And this then is the same as climate change. If the poor continue to pollute, temperatures will rise. We need to make space for the poor's right to development, share growth, share the common atmospheric space. It's also the same for air pollution. In my city of Delhi, as Denise said, I do a lot of work on air pollution. And one of the biggest lessons we've learned is that we have one airshed. If the poor and the rich both emit into the same airshed, so if the poor woman does not get access to clean energy, she will use polluting fuels to cook her food, and it will contaminate the airshed of the rich and the poor. The other thing that we have learned is that climate change, COVID, and air pollution are great equalizers. I keep getting asked in Delhi whether we should buy air purifiers. And I keep saying, yes, buy the air purifier, but you will have to breathe. And so you will have to clean the air. And this is the same as climate change. And we need to understand that these three existential issues are things that we cannot brush away with some new techno fixes. And the other learning that we've had is the sheer dystopian relationship we have with nature, where we are transgressing nature, the nature-human boundary, breaching the line. Today, whatever the talk about the lab, that the virus originated in the lab, we know today that we are far more vulnerable because we are transforming nature through our industrial food systems, our methods of growing food and animals, which destroys biodiversity, makes breeds less resilient, makes us more vulnerable to zoonotic diseases. And this I know I'm trying to join many dots with you, but I'm trying to join these dots to say that they are all connected, that we need to understand how these systems that we have chosen are making us more vulnerable to COVID. And so at the end, so for me, and that's really where I want to spend a little time now to discuss, we need politics in our future. One of the things that we have learned in India, I'm not sure if it is applicable for many of you in the US, so forgive me if it isn't, but I want to share our experience with you, that we are learning the hard way that we cannot first pollute and then clean up. We cannot use technologies that are so capital intensive and so inequitable and still believe that we can be sustainable. So we are learning that we have to do sewage treatment differently if we want our rivers to be clean. We need sanitation for all. We need to reuse and recycle waste water. We need mobility systems that move people and not cars. We need to rethink so that we plan for the very poor. And the bottom line is that sustainability is not possible without inclusive and affordable growth. So the one thing that we need to bring back into our conversation is politics. For the last decade, environmentalism has been about a techno fix. And when I look at net zero, I see another techno fix in front of us, because I see an enormous dependence on disruptive technologies, which will somehow come up in our world, which will somehow clean up the future in the next decade or so. We don't need to worry because some disruptive technology will happen. But I think it's important for us today to discuss the politics of justice, the politics of inequity, and we need those politics to drive the policy and the practice ahead. So for instance, I talked about the dystopian relationship of, um, of, of us with nature. I talked about the fact that we need to rebuild our rural economies. We need to reinvest so that people do not have to leave. And this also means that we need to rethink resilience. Till now, we have built high input agriculture. This has added to risk. And in times of climate change with weird weather, it will increase debt. We need to consider low input but high value resource management. This is a completely new concept for most of us. We talk about it, but we do not practice it enough. In my world, we talk about forests either to protect or to cut. But we need to think about how to use the ecological base that we have for building the livelihoods of very poor. We need to rethink food in terms of nutrition, livelihoods, and nature. But most importantly, we need to rethink growth in terms of well-being of rural communities by putting money in the hands of small producers and rebuilding local economies. This then becomes that cycle that I talked about, where people are going back and the opportunity to reinvest. But the opportunity will only work out if we can rethink what we mean by resilience. It's the same thing when it comes to air pollution. I mean, Denise talked about how when she visited Delhi, we were engaged with our fight against diesel. In all our 20 years of fight against air pollution, one of the most important lessons we have learned is that individual vehicle cleanup will not and has not worked. We clean up, we add more, and the net result is pollution. In our case, local, and in your case, global. So the technology fuel quality improvement, however important, is not enough. And in our part of the world, we know that we cannot afford to first pollute and clean up. We have moved tremendously to clean up our fuel and our vehicle standards. Yet, only 15% of the people in our cities drive today. And already there is huge pollution and congestion. So if 85% more people are going to get onto the car, there is no room on the road or in the airshed. And that really has to drive our need for transformation. The good thing is that in our part of the world, the bad thing is that it's a failure of our imagination that we don't see this. But the good thing is that the car has not replaced the bus, the train, the cycle, or the walk. It has only marginalized it. It has only made it invisible because our planners don't see it. If you look at this and you look at this data, which is from the Indian government, and you look at the four-wheeler, which is the yellow across, these are different cities of India. And you will see that the yellow is the highest when it comes to Delhi, which is 13%, or Chennai, when it comes to, it's 13%. But in most other cities of India, it is still very marginal. People still walk, people still cycle, people take a bus or a train because they are poor. The opportunity now is that how do they do this as we get richer? So we have that huge opportunity to rethink. But this means that we need to rethink it from the point of view of equity in road space use. As I said, and I showed you, only 10 to 15% of India commutes by car, but cars take up 90% of the road space. In Delhi, 26% of the land area is under roads. So where is the space for 80 to 90% to drive? So there is no choice but to plan differently today. And this really should make us think about climate change as well, because this is the fundamental question. when it comes to climate change. But for us, air pollution control is not possible unless we reinvent mobility and city planning. So we cannot talk about cleaner cars, electric cars, fuel efficient cars. These are important, but a very small part of the solution. I find it bizarre that the entire world today is talking about electric cars. It's like that is the panacea for climate change. Yet we know that unless we get people out of cars and we reinvent mobility, we will never drive down transport-related emissions at the scale and pace that we need to do. We know this in our cities, that we cannot plan. We have to plan cities without cars, which means planning for vastly augmented modern public transport with last mile connectivity. And this is the toughest because remember, I just showed you, the poor in our world are so poor that they cannot even afford a bus. And the rich in our world are aspirational and they don't want to take a bus or a train. So we have to ensure that the imagination of our cities, and this has to do with the imagination of our cities across the world, not just in Delhi, not just in Mumbai, not just in Bangkok, but also in Washington. That the imagination of our cities is that you could actually reinvent mobility so that it would be for an inclusive city, not just for an exclusive city. The most fascinating part of the work that we have done in the recent years has been to look at water in waste. And I know this is possibly very far from the work that many of you are doing, but I want to talk about it only because I want to show how we need that new imagination. We need to understand we need our countries to build a new future on our reality. Today, we know that water is a crucial determinant of health in our countries. I mean, if you look at COVID-19, we were told that the way to protect ourselves is to wash our hands. People don't have clean water. And yet we also know that clean water is related to the fact that we should not pollute our rivers, not degrade the available waterways. And in spite of 30 years of huge investment by the government of India, we have failed. And we have failed because we have not recognized our reality. So CSE has been doing what we call shit flow diagrams to understand where does our shit come from and where does our shit go. So we do diagrams like this to understand how much of the sewage or the excreta that is produced is off-site, that is conveyed in underground pipes to sewage treatment plants, and how much of it is on-site, that people actually use septic tanks. And you will be surprised or not surprised to know that the bulk of our cities are not connected to sewage systems. They have on-site systems. Toilets are connected to soak pits, connected to drains or septic tanks, and then excreta is transported from these tanks, or not even, or just connected to a river or a drain. And this then is the cause of the huge pollution that we have. But this is also an opportunity for a new paradigm. I mean, 20 years ago, India was building landlines to connect people with phones. Today, we go through satellites. 10 years ago, the world was building energy grids to connect people with electricity. Today, we are installing solar systems on rooftops. So if we can jump, skip, leapfrog the landline grid route in connectivity, why not in sanitation? And this then becomes this huge opportunity to reuse and reinvent for land. Today's sewage system is water-based. Use water for flushing, water to convey sewage, and after treatment for disposal, we also put it into water. This destroys the nitrogen cycle of the world. Nutrients are lost, food security is lost, water is polluted. So can you actually think of a new model of circular economy where it is land-based sewage, where nutrients, food, excreta is looked at, so that the food that we eat, which takes the nutrients in, the excreta that we have, that nutrients is put back into the land. And so we design deliberately for an affordable sanitation system, which is also nature friendly. And that then becomes the model in terms of moving ahead. So finally, I'd just like to say that this is really our now or never moment. We have never seen this kind of disruption before. And I would imagine that for the first time in our world, and I would hope that there is an appetite to do things differently. I mean, just imagine if we had talked about this a year ago, that we would all be locked up in our homes, worried about moving ahead, wearing masks at all times, keeping a social distance. Would we even think that this would be something that we would agree to do? I mean, I know that in Delhi, when we talked about wearing masks for air pollution, we sort of said, no, we cannot do it. And today we are doing it because of COVID-19. We are working from home. We are not taking out our vehicles. We have cleaner air because of it, but it's come at an incredible cost. This is not the cost of clean air that we need. We need clean air with the livelihoods of the poor secured. But we have seen that disruption. And so we should have the appetite to be ready to do things differently. And the other thing that we have learned from COVID is, as I said, we are interdependent, interconnected. We have to provide for the poor, the disadvantaged. We have no option this time. There is an urgency and there is a reality. The one thing that often we miss is the screams and the voices of the marginalized. But in my world, I know we cannot push them away. We must work for them. And that we know that the politics is critical. Affordable growth is sustainable growth. Inclusive growth is sustainable growth. You cannot divorce the politics of inclusion, of justice from sustainability. And so I know it is very difficult for societies today when we are rebuilding to think and reimagine a kinder, gentler, nature-friendly world, but we must. And this is why we must have this conversation. It needs our imagination and it needs our courage. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sunita. Let me see if I can have my video come back on. Thank you for that inspiring call to action and your advocacy for the poor and disadvantaged. You'll actually be pleased to know that Princeton is taking this issue more seriously right now. We actually have an environmental justice workshop on Wednesday of this week. So we recognize this importance. And I admire your call to be imaginative in finding solutions for sustainable growth. I invite people to post questions in the question and answer dialog box at the bottom of your screen. But maybe to kick things off, as people think over what they'd like to ask you, I'll start by asking you how you think this type of transition should come about. You say that it's necessary, and I think we agree that it's necessary, but then what exactly should be done? And so one thing that we've been thinking a lot about is the feasibility of electrifying economies using renewable energy, which would eliminate air pollution and improve public health, as well as reducing greenhouse gas emissions from carbon dioxide, and if it's from natural gas power, from methane leakage as well. And that this could be useful for the poor because you can electrify buses, you can electrify little motor scooters. In China, we see now, instead of two-stroke moped type vehicles, two-wheel vehicles, we see basically electrified scooters, and people take their small batteries into their apartments and recharge them at night from their regular electric socket. Apartments in China are electrified, so that makes it feasible. It's different, I know, in India for the poorest. But do you see electrification as a viable way to address some of these issues in India for the poor? And then in addition, what suggestions might you have when you say reimagine things? Urban planning is something you've mentioned that is important, and I certainly would agree. And this is also an area we're working on. And as I mentioned, Anu Ramaswamy, the Chada Center, she actually focuses on urban areas. So we have that, we agree. But what specifically are you envisioning?
So let me take the electrification question first. In fact, I mean, if I spoke on air pollution, I would have all those discussions, because for us today, electrification is the critical issue when it comes to cleaning up local air in our cities. We have learned that there is massive use of coal, continues to be, not just in our thermal power plants, but in large number of industries that are using coal today because it is cheap. And that then connects, Janice, to the larger question that, you know, you have to talk about the cost of industrialization. When I talk about coal to the industries in Delhi or in the surrounding areas, their question is, our competitive advantage with other countries comes from the cost of keeping the cost of energy cheap. And the cost of energy we can keep cheap by using very dirty but very cheap coal. And as the minute we move towards an electrified economy, unless it is an efficient electrified economy, unless it is an economy which also does not pollute, it is not better. And that really then becomes the big question for us, because in most of our cities, I mean, in Delhi, for instance, we have closed down the last coal-based power plant. We have also banned the use of coal in most of our industries. Industries have moved to the states which are just outside Delhi, in the adjoining area, and they continue to use large amount of coal. Now, we could move to gas, we could move to cleaner coal in the coal-based power plants, or we could move to renewables, and we could do all three together. Because in a country like India, which is a very different, that's the climate justice story, we can't afford to say no coal at all. But we have to say much cleaner coal because of the local air pollution impacts. It's not so much about climate change as it is about the core benefits that we get and the need for cleaning up coal. Because electrification of our economy does not make sense unless we have clean power.
So if we explore this a little further, would renewable energy be, we know that the cost of renewable energy is decreasing dramatically. I mean, the learning curves are astonishing. So if renewables become much cheaper than coal, and we're seeing that beginning to happen, then it becomes a political question of how do you reduce the use of coal, and you know, the stakeholders who are involved with coal, how do you make that shift? If it actually will be cheaper, then it would be to everyone's advantage to make that change.
No evidence is cheaper yet. I think this is really, I mean, I've seen all those numbers. In India, we have a very, very, you know, ambitious 450 gigawatt plan for renewable energy. We want to move, we want coal to compete with renewable energy, but we are struggling because the cost of finance is so expensive. The cost of capital is so expensive. The cost of risk is so expensive that the cost of finance becomes expensive. And so coal still remains the cheapest option. I mean, we have lost a battle, Denise, last week, which has really made me very, very sad. For 5 years, we worked to get new emission standards for coal-based power plants in the country. We got a court order which would mandate clean coal. But the government has now gone back on it and said, no, because of COVID and because of the economic reasons, we can't move towards cleaner coal right now. And this in spite of the fact that our renewable energy targets we're not able to meet as fast as we want. So I think it's important for us to keep that reality in front of us. So yes, as the cost of renewables gets lower and the cost of capital and finance gets cheaper for countries like India, and we build our renewable future and we replace coal, then yes, electrification is the best answer. today electrification is still a good answer if we can clean coal and we can get out of dirty coal. And I think that to us is the first step ahead.
Okay, thank you for that. Let me look now and see what questions there are from others who've so one question from Louise Dice, and I may just, since this is a very clear, straightforward question, I may just read it and then I'll ask some of the others to articulate their own questions. But she asked, is there a country or two which are doing well, making good progress with sustainability for everyone?
Oh, Jenny, oh, Louis, that's a very tough question. I mean, I think in this world today, I'm not sure. I mean, there are interesting models. There is no doubt that there is some fascinating work happening in different cities of the world, communities of the world, different approaches that people are taking to do better, much more people-centric land management, forest management, showing how food production can be reinvented so that local economies can benefit. Denise asked me, how would you reimagine an urban situation? I mean, I can see a lot of work happening, looking at affordable housing for the very poor, looking at how cities must not be imagined in terms of the sprawl of cities, but re-looking at the traditional design of cities, in which cities were more compact, where roads were more congested with different kinds of modes of transport. I mean, so I think it's really about putting the images together in terms of saying, this is the way we need to go. And it's shock therapy sometimes. If I was to tell you that what you would consider as being really congested and really dirty, which is an old Delhi road, which has every mode of transport in it, including people walking, cycling, two-wheelers, cars, maybe even a horse in the middle of it, and definitely a lot of people in the middle of the road, is probably a more sustainable notion of a road than a road full of cars. But I think that's the reimagining that we first need to do before we can react. And I think that's really where, to me, is the missing link, because we are still not reimagining enough of what that new future can be and must be. And that's really where I have a long answer to your very clear question.
Imagination is key in coming up with creative new ideas. Hervé Thomas has a couple of questions. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your questions?
I think Hervé had to leave, so if you wanted to summarize those.
Okay. His questions are, so he's wondering about, first, your thoughts on India's informal domestic labor economy. And then he is curious as to why you chose these models specifically, the future of work and future of production, to raise awareness about the scale of the impact of these climatic events on people and their livelihoods in the developing world. Why not a model that instead showcases potential economics of efficiency gains for the biggest emitters?
I mean, that's exactly what I'm saying, Hervé. I totally disagree with you. I don't think there are efficiency gains for the biggest emitters. I think we have, I mean, if you look at it in 1992, when we signed the climate agreement, we also signed on an agreement for free trade. And we have created a world, and including my world today, is totally addicted to the notion of a globalized world. And that globalized world is built on discounting the cost of labor and the cost of environmental protection. And that really is at the core of both the crisis that we have today of climate change. It's also the crisis that we have today in terms of poverty, in terms of, environmental degradation in our world. We cannot clean up the air of Delhi if industries in Delhi still want dirty coal because it makes them more competitive with Bangladesh or with Indonesia or with China. Okay? So we have to think about that as much as we think about local air pollution.
Yeah. if there's anyone else who'd like to ask a question, we have a couple more minutes. Let me see, is there, there's a thanks from Louise saying, thanks for your moving presentation and dedicated attitude. Good luck to all of us. And so if there's nothing further at the moment, I think I can second what Louise said. Thank you so much for your inspirational talk, and good luck to India. Good luck to the rest of the world. You're absolutely right. This is at a critical juncture in history, and I hope we can all work together to make rapid progress to address both climate and equity issues around the world. So thank you so much. It's great to see you coming in from India, carbon-free or very, very low carbon. It's actually one of the small benefits of our past year of virtual reality.
I agree.
Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Denise.